We have a saying in Tibetan which goes like this: Ngunjun tembe namtar chinju yuje nyamne. The life stories of past masters serve as guide for the future practitioners. So, since we are intensely in practice in this season, I wanted to touch on practice and wanted to carry on from my sharing on the life of Tsongkhapa, which I did on his anniversary a few weeks ago, maybe a week or two ago, but couldn't finish them. So I wanted to share something from that, not all of this, but maybe save the rest for the next BBC. If I manage to finish, then next BBC will be something else. Anyway, but when it comes to spiritual practice, there are two main things that spiritual practice practitioners and scientists differ. One is, in the case of scientists, they are constantly walking in uncharted areas where no one, at least no scientists, have gone before in the way they wanted to go. So they have to always look and expect for the unexpected, and thus be adventurous as well as uncertain. But in the case of spiritual practice, particularly when it comes to Buddhism, for the present day and future practitioners, that problem is not there. In a way, the path to full awakening, to the highest goal ever, has been already charted and has been walked by many, including our beloved teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. And they have been tested, verified, logically, rationally made sensible, and then walked on them by future many practitioners, many followers who have verified through their experiences the verity of the teachings that Buddha laid down, that the Buddha shared of his own experiences. And at the very least, one could get a glimpse of what it would look like to be Buddha and what it takes in terms of the paths, what are the stations there, what are the milestones there, etc. So that problem is not there, at least. Now, in the case of the actual practicing it, for the scientists, they can rely on the findings of the past masters, past scientists, and then start from there. Very often the saying goes, by standing on the shoulders of others, they can jump from there. They can start by being on their shoulders and then jump high. But that's not the case with the spiritual practitioners. The path may have been laid out very clearly, and even in stages and whatnot, but one has to pick up from where one has left. Nobody can do it for you. You cannot start from where somebody else has already started and left off. So these are two main differences between the scientists' way of doing things and the spiritual practitioners, particularly the Buddhists' prospect of the Buddhists' privilege. The life story of Tsongkhapa is something really worthy to look at and study, as is the case with the life stories of so many other spiritual masters, not only confined to Tibetan world, but all over the world. If we could look into their stories, into their hardships, how they overcome. There are so much insights that we can learn, and we can try it on ourselves and see what comes next. This story of Tsongkhapa is very pertinent here because one, it is our community is following the Mahayana, Vajrayana path, and particularly within the Tibetan orders of Buddhism, the Gelug order of Tibetan Buddhism is the main stream or the main trend that's being followed here. So when it comes to Tsongkhapa's life stories, I don't know how this came about, but we have all started to count 4 major deeds, whether they have origin in mystical prophecies or in who happened to be the first to count them as 4. Anyway, they may have very hidden significances leading up to this time and even in the future, who knows? But most of them relate to events started then and finished few years later or few centuries later, such as restoring the Maitreya statue in Jingchi and adorning it in monks' robes to have a significance for Vinaya teachings to last and in a pure form, particularly embodied by Tsongkhapa himself as instructed by Manjushri, in that he should not overlook even the tiniest or the most minor of the ethical precepts. And when he complained, or at least gave vent to his concern by saying, oh, this may not be practical, as well as others may not look at it as sensible. To that, Manjushri, in ordinary words, shut him up and said, do what as I suggest you. So Tsongkhapa all through his life, he really, really stuck very close to the Vinaya rules. So that was one, and then the other one was towards the end of his life, the consecration of 3-dimensional mandalas of the Vajrayana deities. And then the establishment of the Mölnam festival, which to this day continues, is a different story. But nonetheless, it involves gathering, making prayers, not so much practicing, cultivating quiet in a quiet situation, cultivating inner qualities, but kind of engage in a group assertment of the achievements of the past masters in generating aspirations, whatnot. And then there was the 4th one, which was more in a setting of convention or a conference, or rather a large gathering of sharing, which mainly was led by Tsongkhapa and another contemporary master, I think Gyabcho Pesang, in the field of Vinaya, in really, really expounding on it and making clear, dispelling many misunderstandings and wrong ways of practicing them, etc. So kind of really laid a very strong ground in the Vinaya practice. So those are the 4. But I personally see his works as his main legacies. His works, be that in Vajrayana field, be that in Madhyamika, the philosophy field, and also in the Vinaya field. These are 3 main areas where he really, really made a major contribution. Major contribution not for the sake of just making it, but for this reason that it needed to be. It almost seemed like that was the reason why he was there at that time, when it was desperately needed. Like the understanding of the Madhyamika philosophy was being kind of stretched in all directions in implying the means this, means that, or etc. Some almost bordering to nihilism, etc. And then in the case of Vinaya, as was shared before, it was in a very shattered, tattered form at that time. But yet, at the same time, he didn't himself write extensively on Vinaya, except for a couple of short texts. And there is one that I have yet to look at, which says that it deals with many significant points in Vinaya. Other than that, he has written kind of a guide like Vinaya topic based texts addressing both the Shamanaris, and also the bhikshus, bhikshunis. That's because he didn't see the need of writing any additional Vinaya text, because the texts, as far as the texts were concerned, the existing ones, mainly authored by Kunchen Tsonawa, which is what is studied in all the major orders of Tibetan Buddhism, was very satisfactory, was very well written, very reliable. So he didn't care, he didn't see the need to write. But when it comes to Madhyamika, he really saw the need for making at least his point of different take clear. That too, not just what you call arbitrarily, but based on scriptural authorities as well as backed up by reasonings. And so he dwelled on that extensively across, spanning over 4 or 5 major texts on this topic of Madhyamika. And that too, he waited until he had the eureka moment of really establishing the understanding to the point where he has not the slightest of any unease in holding the position. Until then, he struggled very hard, even after coming out from 3 years of extensive, intensive retreat. He came out unsatisfied on this topic, and still pursued on it. And then later on, with some auspicious signs, be that dreams and otherwise, he then gave another look at Buddha Palita's text, and that kind of really clicked, and everything fell in place. And there was this ease, which kind of really inspired him to write this praise to the Buddha for his teaching of dependent origination. Which we usually call praise to dependent origination. It is rather praising Buddha for his teaching of dependent arising. Dependent arising doesn't need to be praised. It's always there. Nor does emptiness need to be praised. It's always there. In a way, we could say we are always experiencing dependent origination and emptiness. We bump through them, we touch them, except not knowing that's what we are doing. What we are seeking now is a conscious experience of that. But it is always there. And then when it comes to Vajrayana, there again, Vajrayana feels where he didn't care to pen any additional text, like He Vajra, Heruka, Tantra system, and others, which he felt was excellent, what was already existing there. But when it comes to Kuya Samaja, which, by the way, is considered, at least from a Vajrayana Tibetan perspective, the most ultimate essential teaching of the Buddha. The peak of the Buddha's teaching is Kuya Samaja, rooted on the Madhyamika Sutra, Mahayana, understandings and practices rooted in a very strong practice of Vinaya. But nonetheless, Goya Samaja, no matter how difficult it is to practice and how difficult to actualize it, nonetheless, that is the ultimate core essential teaching of the Buddha, where everything, at least a Mahayana aspirant, should be heading to. So in that regard, there were areas where the existing masters of his time in the past already had some position very popular and accepted, yet he cared to differ. One area is that of the dissolution part, where when we usually say the 80 indicative conceptions divided into the 3 of the subtle minds, namely the whitish appearance, reddish expansion. Now I'm using a slightly different translation. And then blackish near attainment. Although the so-called indicative conceptions are divided up into these 3 by way of association, nonetheless, when it comes to dissolving them, their dissolution precedes the dissolution of any one of the 3 to which they are supposed to belong. Whereas the past positions were that they all alternate. They kind of alternate, and they kind of are sandwiched between their own topics that they are, between after their categories or the main branch to which they belong to. So the text that he wrote were seen as necessary, where he brought up points that needed to be clarified, that were misunderstood, etc. Yet at the same time, he also was aware of what was completely acceptable and satisfactory in terms of other fields. So, particularly the texts on Vajrayanas, he waited until he had only 9-10 years to live, which is when he had begun, maybe 2-3 years ago, began to call himself the yogi of this particular deity circle, a yogi of this particular deity circle, which is a very clear indication of how he waited until he had the actual experiences. Only then he penned them down. So his texts kind of really sparkle precision with, as I said earlier, economical in use in words, only writing only when necessary. Kind of each and every word, even in terms of prepositions, where there could be two optionals, which one he chooses has significance. So that's who Tsongkhapa was. So he was a kind of a person who was very much after finding a coherent perspective. To the extent possible, he would push human thinking and human understanding and try to kind of anchor them on a rational basis. Of course, ultimately, the experience has to be internal and personal, whatnot, yet at the same time, to the extent possible, he would push human thinking and reasoning and logic, and thus base all of them on a very, very solid ground. And that's the reason why it really sparkles with so much clarity. I guess I will stop here, and that saves me another chunk for the next PVC to continue with. Thank you so very much.